A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. So, he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. By thoughts, I mean specifically chatter in the skull, perpetual and compulsive repetition of words, of reckoning and calculating. I'm not saying that thinking is bad. Like everything else, is useful in moderation. A good servant, but a bad master. And all so-called civilized peoples have increasingly become crazy and self-destructive because through excessive thinking they have lost touch with reality. That's to say, we confuse science with the real world.
His discovery of the paraverse, as we now know it, the exploration into the capability of the human mind, is not a new one.
We discovered that the paraverse was much like our own world, except that it had been at war for many years. This gave us the perfect environment in which to carry out what had previously only been hypothetical theory.
The CIA were working on MK Ultra from the 1950s, and the Russians had their studies on psychokinesis in the same period. In more recent times, the US Navy had Detachment G, and we here at Witness have been working in the field for nearly 25 years.
Don't move.
It is only now, however, that we are able to see behind the curtain. We've bridged the void between the worlds. And through rigorous testing and endless observation, we are on the cusp of propelling human evolution to a staggering new dimension.
About men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. The best judges are the elites, us smart guys, the cool observers, and we must therefore be ensured the means to impose our will for the common good, of course. This, he said, will require a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda, because of the ignorance and superstition of the masses. Same theme all the way through. The basic problem is this. The idea is that if you have a society in which the voice of the people is heard, you got to make sure that that voice says the right thing. In totalitarian societies, it's not a big problem. You got a club in your hand, and if people don't behave the right way, you hit them with a club or threaten them with it. So it doesn't really matter much what they think. What matters is what they do, and that you control by force. But as the capacity of the state to control by force erodes, it's necessary to control what people think. And in fact, I think you find much more sophisticated concern for thought control precisely as the society becomes more free. I don't think it's surprising that the sophisticated discussion, things like the public relations industry and the academic side of it, and the journalistic side and all these kinds of things I've been sampling, I suspect if one did a comparative study, you'd find that they develop primarily in relatively free societies. Ours is a very free society in the sense that the state has, by comparative standards, very limited resources to control by force. And I think it's undoubtedly, in fact, the most sophisticated in the terms of, in the reliance on techniques of indoctrination and control. Public relations industry in particular is an American creation. You'll notice, of course, the close similarity to Leninist ideology, to Bolshevism, which also assumes that the radical intellectuals are the specialized class, the vanguard, and they've got to lead the stupid and ignorant masses to a better society. In fact, the two conceptions are very much alike. I think that's probably one of the reasons why there's been historically such an easy transition from one to another. The move from being a Leninist enthusiast to a passionate supporter of state capitalism and working for American aims, that takes place overnight. It's been going on for years. It's called the God that failed transition. And it happens very simply. I mean, in the early stages, it had some authenticity to it when people like Ignazio Silone and others were making this transition. But in recent years, it's become just a farce. I mean, technique of opportunism. And the transition is very easy, I think, because there isn't much of a difference in ideological change. It's just a matter of where you think power lies. If you think there's going to be a popular revolution, and you can ride that revolution to state power and then wield the whip over the masses, you're a Leninist enthusiast. If you see that that's not going to happen, and power lies in the state capitalist institutions which you have to serve as a manager, an ideological manager, you do that. But it's basically a very similar position. And in fact, in the last century or so, since there's been a more or less identifiable secular intelligentsia, I think you find typically that they fall into one or the other of these two categories. They associate themselves with one or the other system of power and hierarchy and subordination. In fact, what I just said is almost a tautology. It's only if you submit to those systems that you're counted as a respectable intellectual, for obvious reasons. Well, coming up to more modern times, in the post-Second World War period, you find, again, a deep concern over the need to control and deceive the public, to control the public mind. Presidential historian Thomas Bailey wrote in 1948, at the time when we were sort of setting off on a new war, the Cold War, he wrote, "Because the masses are notoriously short-sighted and generally cannot see danger until it's at their throats, our statesmen are forced to deceive them into an awareness of their own long-run interests. Deception of the people may in fact become increasingly necessary unless we're willing to give our leaders in Washington a freer hand." And in 1981, as the United States was launching a new crusade for freedom, Samuel Huntington, the professor of government at Harvard, said in a private but published discussion, interchange, "You may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you're fighting." That's what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine, which is quite accurate and gives a certain insight into the nature of the Cold War, in particular into the nature of the war against Nicaragua, which is what he specifically had in mind. Well, these concerns over controlling the public mind tend to rise to the surface, particularly after periods of wars and turmoil, like the 17th century revolution, the Civil War, or like the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson launched the major Red Scare, which is the major example in modern American history, of all of American history, of state repression. That was really large-scale and effective in destroying unions and destroying independent politics and eliminating independent thought and so on. And the same thing happened after World War II with the phenomenon that's mislabeled McCarthyism. It's mislabeled because it was actually initiated by the Liberal Democrats in the late 1940s. McCarthy just came along at the tail end of it and vulgarized it a little. The reason for this is that periods of wars and turmoil have a tendency to arouse people from apathy and to make them think and to make them organize often. So that's why you get things like the Red Scare and McCarthyism right after periods of war and turmoil, and the same thing happened after the Vietnam War, which had the same effect. After the Vietnam War, elites were concerned about what they called a crisis of democracy. In fact, one of the most interesting books on this topic, or one of the most interesting books on, most of the insightful books, I think, on the modern democratic system, is called The Crisis of Democracy. It's a study, the only book-length study published by the Trilateral Commission. It's an important group put together by David Rockefeller in 1973, and it represents the more or less liberal internationalists from the three major centers of modern capitalism: the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, hence trilateral. And remember, this is the liberals. This is the group out of which Jimmy Carter and most of his administration came. What's the crisis of democracy that they're concerned with in all of the democratic societies? Well, the crisis is that during the 1960s, large groups of people who are normally passive and apathetic began to try to enter the political arena to press their demands. And that's a crisis which has to be overcome. The naive might call that democracy, but that's because they don't understand. The sophisticated understand that that's a crisis of democracy. The American spokesman, again Samuel Huntington, wrote in his report that Harry Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. In those days, there was no crisis of democracy. Things were working just right. But in the 1960s, you got all this turmoil. I mean, young people and women and, labor. I mean, all kinds of weird people who were supposed to be sitting quietly in the corners began to get involved and caused this crisis. I mean, the same crisis that arose in the 17th century and that repeatedly arises when people begin to try to take advantage of the formal opportunities that exist. Among the terrible things that were happening during the 60s causing this crisis, they said, was that you had this group of people who they called value-oriented intellectuals, people who were concerned with things like truth and justice and all that sort of nonsense, and they're opposed to the good guys, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. They called them the commissars, the ones who just do the job, but you had these value-oriented intellectuals, and they were doing all sorts of horrible things like delegitimizing the institutions that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young, like schools and universities. Remember, this is an internal discussion, so they kind of let their hair down. Their general proposal at the end of all of these lengthy and thoughtful discussions was that what we need is more moderation in democracy to mitigate the excess of democracy and to overcome the crisis. In plain terms, what that means is that the public has to be reduced to their proper state of apathy and obedience and driven from the public arena if democracy is to survive in the appropriate sense, with the specialized class, the cool observers, smart guys, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, doing our job in the interests of the people who have real power. That's the liberal side. I won't go into what the reactionary side says about the matter. Well, to summarize, there is a standard view of democracy. It's the view of Justice Powell. The public should assert, or the view that he expressed at least, the view that the public ought to assert meaningful control over the political process. And there's a contrary view. The contrary view is that the public's a dangerous enemy, and it has to be controlled for its own good, of course, the way you control children, like you don't let a 3-year-old run across the street. The first view is the rhetorical view. The second view is the view that's actually held, and you can see that it's actually held when a crisis of democracy erupts and the unwashed masses begin to try to enter into the political arena and have to be somehow repressed, either by force, as in the Red Scare, or by other means in order to overcome the crisis of democracy. Well, with regard to the media play a big role in this, and with regard to the media, too, there is a standard view. The standard view, for example, is expressed again by Justice Powell in the same discussion when he claims that it's the crucial role of the media to affect the societal purpose of the First Amendment, that is, to allow the public to assert control of the political process. Standard view was also expressed by Judge Gerfine in an important decision, the Pentagon Papers decision, when he permitted the New York Times to publish the Pentagon Papers. And he said, we have a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. That's one view. That's the standard view. And given that view, we then have a debate. The debate is over whether the media have gone too far in their defiance of authority and their adversarial stance. Now, the right wing claims they've gone too far. They're overcome by a liberal bias. We've got to do something about it. The liberals, as in the Trilateral Commission, all in fact agree. In the same study, they say that the media threaten government authority by their adversarial stance, and they've got to be curbed. If they can't curb themselves, the government is going to have to move in to curb them. The executive director of Freedom House, Leonard Sussman, asked whether free institutions must free institutions be overthrown by the very freedom they sustain. Rhetorical question, meaning we got to do something about this excess freedom that the press is using to attack the government. He was writing about a Freedom House study of the coverage of the Tet Offensive, which became a sort of a classic, allegedly showing that the press lost the war in Vietnam by unfair criticism of the government during the Tet Offensive. It's an interesting, if there's no time to talk about it, I may try to get back to it. If not, maybe get to it in discussion. Very interesting study. It was total fraud. Falsified the data, the whole thing was faked. When you actually correct the errors, it turns out that the real charge of Freedom House was that the press, although completely supportive of the government policy and working completely within the framework of government propaganda, nevertheless was too pessimistic, they said. They didn't tell you by what standards it was too pessimistic. The obvious standard is to compare it with, say, internal U.S. intelligence assessments, which we have thanks to the Pentagon Papers, and it turns out the press was more optimistic than U.S. intelligence because they were believing the public statements and they didn't know about the private statements. So Freedom House's complaint reduces to the fact that the press, though totally supportive of the propaganda, didn't do it in an upbeat enough fashion. I wouldn't have surprised George Orwell that should be the criticism of the press produced by an organization called Freedom House. But that's become the standard since. Everyone refers to that as the study that proves that the press was too adversarial. Well, that's the debate. Then the defenders of the press say, no, we're not too adversarial. Maybe we are too adversarial, but you got to tolerate us even though we're cantankerous and so on. That's essentially the issue. Well, outside of that debate, between those who say the press is too adversarial and must be curbed, and those who say, well, yes, the press is cantankerous and impossible, but we just have to suffer that in the interest of freedom, outside the spectrum of that debate, which constitutes virtually the entire mainstream discussion, but outside the debate, there is another position. The other position challenges the factual assumption that's taken for granted in the debate. According to this alternative view, the media do indeed fulfill a societal purpose, but a very different one. Their societal purpose is to inculcate and defend the economic and social and political agenda of the privileged groups that dominate the domestic society. And they do this in all sorts of ways. They do it by selection of topics, by distribution of concern, by the way they frame issues, by filtering of information, by emphasis and tone, by simple fabrication sometimes, but crucially by the bounding of debate to make sure that it doesn't go outside of certain limits. The bounding both in the news columns and in the opinion columns, because of course the news columns themselves embody all sorts of assumptions and ideological presuppositions and so on. According to this alternative view, to the extent that there is a liberal bias, it serves primarily to bound thinkable thought, that is, to instill the unchallengeable assumptions, which in fact reflect this rather narrow elite consensus. So the liberal bias performs a real function. It says, thus far and no further. I'm as far as you can go, and I go as far, how far I go is still accepting the basic presuppositions as unchallengeable. Now, within those bounds, there's ample controversy, and it reflects the tactical divisions among elites over how to achieve generally shared aims, but these limits are very rarely transcended. So the media thus function in accordance with what my co-author Edward Herman and I have called a propaganda model in a recent book. That's another view. Well, the propaganda model has a lot of predictions. It has a lot of predictions about how the press is going to behave, but it also has a further prediction. The further prediction is that no matter how well confirmed the propaganda model is, it cannot be taken seriously, and therefore must be effectively excluded from mainstream discussion. And that actually follows from the model itself. The reason is that the model, if you think it through, the model rejects certain principles that are serviceable to power. That is, it falls outside the spectrum defined by the presupposition that the media are adversarial and cantankerous, perhaps excessively so. Now, that presupposition is a useful one. It's serviceable to the interests of established institutions to believe that what you're reading is actually criticism if it's in fact support. That's a technique, it's a sophisticated technique of indoctrination. And of course, it's very serviceable to the media themselves. It's nice to think that you're, pride yourself on being an independent and courageous adversary of power. And since those assumptions are serviceable, they're going to be upheld according to the propaganda model, and no serious challenge will be permitted. So that prediction, indeed, is very readily confirmed. The propaganda model is never taken seriously. It can't be considered. Notice that the propaganda model has a rather disconcerting feature to it. Plainly, as a matter of logic, it's either valid or invalid. If it's invalid, you can dismiss it.